So there, she talked about these three elements, right? So you have them in your slides, kind of what the different pieces. What I thought was really interesting about her conceptualization is she said, well, these are actually issues that are common in autism or in Asperger's syndrome. Not necessarily, it's not the anxiety, but it's what's common. But they set the stage for, they predispose an individual, or they may precipitate the development of emotional or behavioral problems. If you have, and what combinations you have, of maladaptive information processing with regard to others, yourself, or the non-social world. And we'll see kind of the visual of what that looks like. I've given you in the slides, but we'll review that in a second. What's useful about an information processing approach in terms of your understanding and how you conceptualize is, again, it gives you opportunities or inroads of building skills. The idea behind an information processing approach is if you can isolate where the processing is not going right, you can help to rectify that. So what's really important about kind of maladaptive processing of information that comes from others is, in addition to what we commonly talk about, like difficulties reading social cues in others or social context in others, it's this idea that to do this well, to have adaptive information processing of others, we need to be able to analyze the information that we do pick up. It's not that, so one is you need to have a radar, you need to be able to pick up the information. The second is you need to be able to analyze that information correctly and often in an automatic way. When we process social information from others, for the most part, we're doing that with little effort, right? We do that implicitly. Right? So that's part of being adaptive, is that we have things that we do in an implicit way. As soon as we must rely on explicit kind of thinking about it, planning about it, right? Kind of it's no longer automatic. It requires much more energy, much more mental effort. As I said before, it's the first thing to go to the wayside. So part of the process here then is, what do we do? If you have somebody who's actually quite skilled, I talked to somebody on the break, mentioned about psychosocial masking that many women on the spectrum demonstrate, right? That there's this underrepresentation of women diagnosed with autism because they have autism, but they have compensatory skills. So they don't, quote unquote, look like they have autism because they're a little bit better on their nonverbals and they're more aware, and they use that awareness, they compensate for their challenges. Things still don't come automatically per se for the person, but they're able to compensate, right? But if that's the case, if somebody doesn't have the ability, or they're just doing it kind of in this voluntary way, conscious way, what can we do to help them in that situation to reduce the chances that what they're going to do is going to be maladaptive? Has anybody taught kids here to tie their shoes? Right? When they're first tying their shoes, when a child is first tying their shoes, how easy is it for that child to tie the shoes? Not, right? And after a while, right, does it require, you don't yell at the kid, right? I bet you are probably, everybody's helping professionals here, you're probably really encouraging, you're probably enthusiastic, but you're calibrating the level of enthusiasm. You probably are setting a situation where they don't have to tie their shoes really quickly, they're not in a rush, right? You're modifying the setting events. Right? So you're creating the right structures, the right kind of scaffolding for them to have the practice. So it's not just about telling them what to do and then expecting them to practice it. You're creating the setting events so that where they practice and the experience of practicing is one that's almost errorless. Right? And then you're probably fading that. You're probably moving back in a very sensitive way, calibrating how much of the scaffolding exists. So it's not just about show one or teach one, teach one, do one. It's repeated kind of exposures and applications with gradually less scaffolding that facilitates an automaticity of a learned behavior. Whether it's something like tying your shoes or juggling, or it has to do with processing cues from our environments. So it requires a lot more practice. And this is why we can't do this alone. You can't just do something like that if you want to intervene in that way and create things to make them automatic when we analyze and process information. You can't do that by yourself 1 hour a week in a therapy session, right? You need to create environments in the communities, social contexts, where there can be repeated practice opportunities in a structured way. Does that exist? Yes. Those things exist in our communities. You don't have to go and create it, but you have to maybe help and go and find it or facilitate that brokerage, right? I often show, I'm not going to show it today and tomorrow, but if you were at the keynote I presented a few months ago, I've showed it. There's this young man with autism who put on a mascot outfit and kind of emerged and became far more social and more comfortable in social situations being a mascot in his school Friday Night Lights kind of setting. And it was this perfect fit of meaningful social activity and repeated exposure and opportunities for practice around the social domain. That's what made the big difference for him. It wasn't being taught in a session 1 hour a week that this is how you're supposed to think or process information. So to create automaticity might mean thinking socially and thinking ecologically about what we can do. I hope it's okay that I go on these tangents and I kind of try to show you how there are interventions for a lot of these deficits that we identify, a lot of these problems that we identify. My hope is that you have these light bulb moments that you're thinking, oh yes, we have stuff like that here. I know of things like that, or I hadn't thought about that. So in addition to issues of processing information about others, Gauss talks about difficulties in two ways that people with autism often have problems processing information about themselves. The first is about how they are aware of and regulate their arousal. So coming here today and about to present to you all, and I drank a whole bunch of coffee this morning, I was very aware that my heart was beating quickly, right? I was aware of the physical sensations that were going on. Right? They didn't surprise me. They didn't just come out of the blue. I could feel them happening in a gradual way, so they didn't shock me. They didn't scare me. I didn't appraise them in a negative way because I could understand the context. I knew why. I could make sense of them. I knew I drank too much coffee. I also had some problem-solving skills to moderate that arousal. I drank some water. I stopped drinking my coffee. A number of different processes went on, right? Information processes about that information. So it's just an example about these very things that are happening all the time. But think about all of the different pieces that went on with me, managing what could have been a panic attack. Right? So much easier. I could have gone another way. I could have finished my coffee. Maybe, oh, I don't feel right. I don't feel good. Maybe I just need to finish this because it tastes so good. And then I'll feel better because when I drink coffee, I feel better. Maybe then my heart beats really fast and I start to say, what's wrong? My heart's beating fast. Something's wrong. Right? These people aren't nice. Why is that person looking at me that way? Am I having a heart attack? I think I'm going to throw up. Oh my God, I'm going to throw up. Oh my God, right? I can go that route. And then what would happen? My physiological sensations would become even stronger. I would experience them legitimately more, and I could have a panic attack. And if I kept doing that repeatedly across different situations, and then I started to worry about that, I would have a panic disorder. I'm going through this detail to show for me to avoid that situation, I had to have an adaptive way of processing information about myself. Not the conceptual self, my physical self. Okay? So it involves kind of processing information about arousal, information about my sensory environment, right? As well as my motor. How do I calibrate myself within my context? So this is information that's often, processes that are often impaired in people with autism, regardless of if they develop mental health issues, but it sets the stage for those mental health issues. And lastly, processing information about the non-social world. So she talks about social as being social out and social as being self as part of the social world. And here she talks about, more broadly, cognitive control. And I really like this idea of cognitive control. Think about how many people you work with who struggle around flexibly allocating their mental resources to control and to actively guide their thoughts and their behaviors to reach some type of goal that's meaningful to them. Think about the different steps in that process, right? I need to be able to determine what is an important goal for myself that I value and that's valued, okay? Something that's adaptive in nature, right? So I have to think about that goal. I have to identify what it is. I have to be able to allocate my resources to planning for that goal. If I perseverate a lot on something else, if I ruminate on the past, if I'm stuck in that way, it might be hard for me to allocate that. And I need to be able to actively control my thoughts and my actions to do so. Right? We do this probably automatically, But if you don't go through this process, that's going to set the stage for a lot of, even if this has nothing to do with other people, problems. Okay? And certainly we have to think about central coherence. So this idea of seeing detail or seeing the big picture. And we know that many people with autism struggle with central coherence, right? They're awesome systematizers who can really pick up on details. And that can be very useful in some settings and some challenges. But the problem with that when it comes to making sense about the world, even the non-social world, is that we need to be able to go back and forth. We need to be able to see detail, and then we need to be able to see the big picture. Something as simple as navigating a map, right? And looking at a map and then realizing where you are in the actual space when you look up, right? I took a walk in Stanley Park over yesterday, and I can't tell you how many times I had to look at a map, which is a representation of the real, and then I had to take that and say, okay, where am I? So if I turn this, then that would be there on the map, right? It has nothing to do with other people, but it has everything to do with how I'm navigating and processing my non-social world. It wasn't stressful for me. I could do it. But if I'm struggling with central coherence, if I only see details and I can't see the big picture, then when it comes to conceptual issues as well as problem-solving issues, I'm going to struggle. So what Gauss talks about is that you've got these three domains, right? Problems about processing information about others, about the self, and about the non-social world. And there's all of these things that could go wrong. I might struggle with receptive language skills, right? So when it comes to information about others, it might be difficult for me to process what people are telling me, right? All the information that they're telling me, that they're giving me through their language, right? I might have problems with the social cues or with theory of mind. And I've got issues with information about processing about myself, we talked about, and the non-social world, like planning and central coherence. So when you have problems, and this is where her dynamic, remember, so this is where the arrows come in. The conceptualization are those arrows. So when you have problems that are related to processing information about yourself or information about others, that leads to, she suggests, behavioral differences that get exhibited in people with autism. Differences where you might have odd movements or mannerisms, issues with expressive language might emerge because you're feeling overwhelmed and because you struggle with the kind of communicating with understanding other states, right? You might appear rude because you don't behave in the right way because you're not aware of how you're feeling and you're not aware of your social context. If you're struggling with processing non-social information and issues about the self, then you might have issues with self-management. So the behavioral piece, she suggests, when you see outward, how does this help you? How can this be useful for you in your context? When you have presenting problems that are coming to you that have a very heavy externalizing component or behavioral component, then you can say, well, according to this framework, let me ask questions about how there are information processing issues about the self and about others, because there's probably a story there about that. When you see issues with self-management, so procrastination, poor problem solving across whatever kind of problems, an inability to problem solve, problems with task management, time management, those kinds of things, you could ask yourself, well, there's still going to be issues about the self. It always involves the self, but probably with other information processing impairments around the non-social world. So it's interesting that she breaks them down, though, into these two pieces. Behavioral issues, which are more externalizing and related. What are the non-common factors? The behavioral problems often mean that one of the mediators or buffers, we could say, or explanatory pieces is going to be about how they deal with others, if there are behavioral issues. And when it comes to self-management, it's going to be how they practice and the skills they have when it has to do with issues that are non-social in nature. When you have both of these, they can lead to behavioral differences, have a lot of social consequences, makes sense, right? You've got behavioral externalizing issues are powerful shapers of our environments, right? They have consequences as we behave in negative ways, in maladaptive ways, right? And when you have problems with self-management, that has adaptive behavior consequences, daily living consequences. And she suggests that many, not all, but many of the mental health difficulties associated with autism are because of a combination of issues related to adaptive behavior, daily living issues, right? And the social consequences that occur from people's behavior. Right? So imagine, when you are down here, right at the end of her model, which is, I've got anxiety and depression, You could kind of, the conceptualization is all the stuff under the surface. This is all the stuff kind of, yeah, below the waterline, right? You're seeing the tip of the iceberg. You're seeing the anxiety or the depression. And when you start to say, tell me more about that, you start to probably learn about, you probably get content areas of stress. I feel so stressed all the time. I can't deal with this, right? I've experienced the stress. And that you probably are identifying as clinicians that there's issues around social support, formal or informal social support. Make sense? Right? And she's linking those back to, so you could kind of follow the, if you wanted to, the trail crumbs back to information processing impairments. Why am I spending time talking about this? Because you can, you know, this is the content here. This is what we bring into the room, right? Probably this, but no, this is what we bring into the room. These pieces here is what we learn about the person as we start to say, tell me more about that. Can you give me some other examples? And you start to see patterns that are beyond a specific content area. So you know what, I'm not psychodynamically oriented, but I'll give credit where credit is due, right? There is content and there is process, okay? Don't get stuck on content and lose sight of the process, right? These are the processes. And why? Because when it comes to intervening, if you want to empower yourself to have if you want to empower yourself to have many options to intervene and to realize, oh, I could do something here or here or here or here, you want to be able to try to have yourself that cognitive complexity to hold these many arrows in at the same time, okay? Now, this might all be completely nonsensical to you and, you know, not useful, so then just disregard it and go back to the 4 Ps and like Wood's model that I talked about. I just want you to pick what you think is going to be useful, okay?